The parish where the Pritchards lived was the kind of place where silence carried further than words, where people learned to measure their lives by harvests, marriages, and graves dug into the damp soil of the churchyard. The Pritchards were respected, at least outwardly. Their land stretched across rolling fields. Their home was a stone manor with thick walls that seemed older than the village itself, and their family name was tied to charitable donations that bought new pews for the church and a fresh bell for the steeple. To most eyes, they were model parishioners, a family of means who kept to themselves yet never failed to appear in the front pew on Sunday mornings. Yet for all their presence, there were absences that pressed on the village like a fog. The Pritchards' children were never baptized in the parish font. No bells were rung to welcome them into the world. No ink marked their names in the parish ledger. No small graves bore their initials in the cemetery. The vicar could not recall ever placing holy water upon their foreheads, though he swore he had seen Margaret Pritchard heavy with child more than once. The villagers explained it to themselves in hushed conversations that never rose above whispers. Perhaps the children were frail and died in infancy before the church could mark them down. Perhaps the family had reasons of faith too private to share. But these explanations carried unease rather than comfort. The manor stood like a locked chest, its windows staring blankly outward, its gardens too well kept to suggest neglect yet too lifeless to invite joy. What lay behind those walls seemed to vanish from the public record before it was ever truly seen. For years, suspicion was only a quiet undercurrent. It stirred when a worker disappeared after a season's harvest, when his wages were said to have been paid yet no one saw him leave town. It deepened when travelers spoke of lights burning in the orchard long after midnight, torches weaving in patterns that did not seem like mere tending of trees. Some swore they heard the faint wailing of infants carried on the wind, followed by silence so absolute it left a ringing in the ears. No proof ever surfaced, and the Pritchards themselves continued to appear polished and proper, nodding politely to their neighbors, their faces calm masks that betrayed nothing of what might be happening within their home. The more charitable villagers convinced themselves that grief had hardened the family into secrecy. But those less willing to soften the story began to wonder if grief alone could explain how completely the Pritchards erased their children from the world. Baptism, burial, record-keeping. These were not just religious rites, but the very means by which life and death were acknowledged in the community. To step outside of them was to strip existence itself away, to treat human beings as if they had never drawn breath. Inside the manor, it was said, no cries of newborns were ever heard for long. Servants reported muffled sounds behind doors that were quickly stilled. Those who spoke too much about it seemed to vanish from employment without explanation, their names never spoken again. What remained constant was the image of Thomas Pritchard, the patriarch, sitting in the front pew of the church with his wife by his side, their expressions grave, their presence heavy. Nothing about them appeared monstrous, and perhaps that was the most unsettling part. They seemed ordinary, respectable, untouched by scandal. It was this very normalcy that allowed suspicion to remain whispers instead of accusations, rumors instead of action. The church registers contained pages where names should have been, dates left blank as if awaiting children who never arrived. The vicar, who prided himself on thoroughness, would sometimes glance at these empty spaces and feel an unease he could not put into words. It was not absence that troubled him most, but the sense of something carefully hidden, deliberately withheld. He once admitted late in life that when he looked upon the manor, he felt as if the very walls were papered with missing names, as though the house itself consumed identity and left only silence behind. This silence was not passive. It pressed on the community, demanding compliance. No one wanted to be the one to challenge the Pritchards, to accuse them without proof, to risk becoming another missing entry in the unspoken ledger. And so the village learned to avert its eyes. Mothers held their children closer when they passed the gates. Fathers discouraged questions, and children grew up knowing there were houses you did not approach and names you did not speak too loudly. The Pritchards became less a family than a shadowed presence, shaping behavior without ever needing to act in public. Over time, even the orchard became a point of unease. Its fruit grew large and heavy, but many villagers refused to eat it, muttering that the soil had been fed by something more than compost. At harvest festivals, baskets of apples and pears were offered by the Pritchards with smiles that seemed rehearsed. Yet more than one villager claimed the fruit carried a bitter aftertaste no sugar could mask. It was as if the land itself bore witness to what was done in secret, and no feast or offering could cleanse it. The Pritchards' wealth grew, their standing remained secure, and the whispers never reached the level of scandal. Yet in the quiet of their own homes, families spoke of missing workers, of children who seemed to appear and vanish too quickly, of lights that danced in the night. No one dared to challenge the Pritchards directly, but everyone sensed the weight of what was missing. Records that should have existed did not. Graves that should have been dug were absent. Names that should have been spoken aloud were swallowed into silence. This was how evil persisted, not with loud declarations or bloody spectacles, but with the calm efficiency of erasure. The Pritchards hid behind the appearance of respectability, allowing their darkness to thrive precisely because it was clothed in normalcy. And though no one yet knew the full extent of what their walls concealed, the silence itself was already enough to poison the village, leaving every family aware that something unnatural had taken root among them. The manor stood unchallenged, its doors closed, its windows blank, the lives inside undocumented and ungrieved. The parish adjusted to its absence as though it were normal, the missing names becoming part of the air they breathed. Yet the silence could not last forever. In time, whispers would become suspicions too sharp to ignore, and the first cracks in the Pritchards' facade would appear. What waited within was darker than anyone in the village could imagine, for the house without records was not merely a house. It was a ledger of erased lives, and its pages were only beginning to be opened. Margaret Pritchard was always spoken of as a woman of delicate constitution, a figure who carried herself with quiet grace, her pale hands clasped tightly in church, her head bowed as though the weight of her prayers were heavier than those of anyone else. To the parish, she seemed devout, even sorrowful, a mother whose eyes carried the look of someone touched too often by loss. She never stayed long in conversation, offering soft smiles before retreating back to the manor, the folds of her dark dress sweeping the ground like shadows. People pitied her more than they feared her, until the pity began to curdle into something else. For though her body bore the unmistakable signs of childbirth on more than one occasion, not a single infant was ever carried through the church doors to be baptized, nor laid to rest in the churchyard. Margaret explained it when pressed, her voice steady and unshaken, as though she had rehearsed the words for years. Her children, she said, were born too frail for the world. They did not survive long enough for the public rituals of life or death. She spoke as though it were a private misfortune, a curse that had visited her house alone, something that made her too broken to share in the customs of others. She spoke of it without tears, her face calm, as though she had accepted it as the natural order of things. And yet the villagers could not help but wonder why no small graves bore the Pritchard name, why the tolling of bells that marked even the briefest lives was never heard for her children. It was the servants who whispered first. A scullery maid once claimed she heard the cries of an infant late in the night, thin wails that rose from deep within the manor, only to stop with sudden finality, as though a hand had closed over the child's mouth. Another swore that she saw Margaret pacing the halls at dawn, a bundle clutched to her breast, her lips moving as if in lullaby, though no sound escaped her. By morning the bundle was gone, and Margaret appeared at breakfast as serene as ever, her hands folded neatly, her gaze distant. Those who spoke too openly of what they had heard or seen often found themselves dismissed without notice, their wages paid in silence, their names never spoken by the family again. The house itself seemed to conspire with Margaret's words. Windows were kept shuttered, curtains drawn, and doors closed to anyone not bound by blood. The air around the manor was thick with secrecy, as though even the walls had been instructed not to let sound escape. The cries that servants swore they heard were brief, fleeting things, always ending before proof could be gathered. And when curious villagers asked after the missing graves, Margaret would answer softly that some lives were too short for the earth to claim, that heaven had taken them before the soil could. She spoke the words with such composure that many forced themselves to believe her, though unease continued to coil through the parish like smoke that would not disperse. The suspicion grew sharper with time. Women who had buried their own infants bristled at Margaret's calm detachment, her lack of mourning. They knew the rawness of grief, the way it tore at the body and left a mother hollow. Yet Margaret's sorrow seemed too polished, too composed, as if it were a mask she wore rather than a wound she carried. Men muttered in taverns that even a frail child left a body, that even the smallest life required a grave. Where, they asked, were those bodies? Where had the Pritchards placed them? Rumors began to attach themselves to the orchard, to the locked rooms of the manor, to the stillness of the house where life seemed to flicker only briefly before it was extinguished. Some claimed Margaret believed her children too impure for baptism, that she kept them hidden until they expired, never allowing the vicar's blessing to touch them. Others whispered that the family was bound to some ancient oath, that children had to be given back to the land in ways not meant to be spoken aloud. Nothing was certain, but the absence itself became unbearable. The silence around the Pritchard children more damning than any accusation. What disturbed the villagers most was not just the possibility of death, but the careful erasure of it. Margaret never wept openly, never placed flowers on any unmarked ground, never allowed the parish to share in her loss. In a community where grief was communal, where bells tolled and neighbors carried coffins on their shoulders, her silence was an act of separation, a deliberate refusal to let others witness her family's fate. This secrecy began to feel less like sorrow and more like control, a way of owning death itself. In private, some wondered whether Margaret found satisfaction in this hidden cycle. She was described by former servants as meticulous, almost ritualistic in the way she prepared her rooms. Cradles lined with stiff linen were kept long after infants supposedly passed. Small garments were sewn but never seen upon children outside. Rocking chairs creaked at odd hours, though no one sat in them. It was as though Margaret staged the appearance of motherhood for herself alone, rehearsing it in empty rooms where no one could intervene. The vicar, pressed by villagers, once tried to raise the subject with her. She smiled faintly and said her faith told her that heaven received her children without the need of earthly witnesses. Her calm dismissal of ritual, her refusal to let the parish sanctify her losses, unsettled him deeply. He would later confess to a colleague that her composure chilled him more than grief would have, as though she had not lost children at all but had chosen to remove them from the world on her own terms. No evidence could be found, no graves uncovered, no records forged, yet the sense of something cruel within the house deepened with every season. The cries at night, the sudden silences, the absence of any proof that children had lived. These were enough to keep the parish in a state of quiet dread. Margaret remained serene, her face unchanging, her words unwavering, while around her the whispers grew louder. People began to look at the manor not as a home touched by misfortune, but as a place that consumed life before it could be counted, a house where children were born only to vanish into silence. The villagers could not yet imagine the scale of what was hidden, but they felt its shadow pressing on them nonetheless. Each missing name was a weight, each unmarked grave a reminder of something unnatural. The parish had learned to avert its eyes, but with every season it became harder to ignore the truth. Margaret Pritchard's children were not too frail for the world. They were erased from it deliberately, their brief cries silenced, their existence denied. And behind the calm face of the mother stood a cruelty that no one yet dared to confront, though the signs were already too many to dismiss. Thomas Pritchard was not spoken of with pity as his wife was. He carried no mask of fragility, no veil of delicate sorrow. His presence was hard, controlled, and deliberate. When he entered the church, it was not with the bowed head of a humble parishioner, but with the exact step of a man who measured every pace. He sat as though he were part of the very structure, his dark eyes fixed ahead, his lips pressed so tightly together that they seemed carved in stone. He had little interest in conversation with neighbors. What he valued was order. Order in his estate, in his accounts, and in the lives around him. To Thomas, people were entries in ledgers, values on a page, lives tallied and erased at will. He kept a private room in the manor that few ever entered. To the household, it was known simply as the study, though those who carried coal or water into it would later describe the strange unease it inspired. Stacks of books lined the shelves, but what filled the room most were piles of ledgers. They sat in neat rows, their spines inked with dates stretching back generations. Candles burned low beside them, dripping wax across the covers until they hardened into strange seals. Thomas spent long hours at the desk, quill in hand, writing and rewriting, his face illuminated by the faint flicker of flame. It was said he would not tolerate interruption, that any servant who lingered too long in the doorway would be dismissed with a glare sharp enough to stop the breath in their throat. What no one outside the household fully knew was the depth of his obsession. Thomas collected records not only of his family but of the parish itself. He bribed and coerced access to the church registers, sometimes on the pretense of checking family history, sometimes under the claim of restoring damaged pages. But when the vicar found pages missing, smudged with soot, or torn from the binding entirely, he began to suspect something more deliberate. On one occasion, a whole year's worth of baptism entries disappeared, the parchment later discovered in the ashes of the manor's hearth. Thomas had burned them carefully, leaving behind only fragments of names that no longer belonged to anyone. In their place, he kept his own ledgers. These books were written in his hand, filled with lines of neat script that mimicked official records but with blank spaces where names should have been. Sometimes there were only numbers, tallies of births and deaths stripped of identity. At other times there were entries that stopped mid-sentence, as though he had begun to acknowledge a child or servant but decided halfway through that they no longer deserved to exist even on paper. The effect was chilling. These were not merely records but instruments of erasure, a methodical rewriting of reality in which Thomas decided who counted and who did not. The blank entries grew across generations, entire branches of family trees cut short before they could spread. In one book he listed dates of birth beside the word frail, repeated dozens of times, each line ending without detail, as if the word itself was enough to extinguish a life. In another he marked small crosses without names, symbols that might have stood for children or workers or perhaps no one at all. He seemed to delight in creating absence, in replacing the fullness of life with silence on the page. Servants whispered that he spoke to the ledgers when he was alone, murmuring as if the empty spaces answered him. They claimed he ran his hands across the pages with the tenderness of a father stroking a child's hair, his fingers pausing on the blanks as if feeling for the breath of those he had erased. Some said he smiled then, not the hard smile of public life, but something softer, more satisfied, as though the emptiness he had created brought him comfort. What unsettled the parish most, though they did not yet know the details, was the growing gap between what they lived and what was recorded. A worker who lived for years on the Pritchard estate could vanish from the records as if he had never existed. A child born to a servant might not appear in baptismal rolls, their life acknowledged only by whispered memory. When disputes arose about inheritance or wages, the Pritchards' documents carried more weight than the fading memories of villagers. With each burned page and each false ledger, Thomas was reshaping the reality of the parish, replacing truth with his own order. The cruelty of it was not in violence, at least not in the way the world commonly understood it, but in the stripping away of identity before life could even take root. To Thomas, existence was conditional, granted only if it served his design. He believed names gave power, that to erase a name was to claim dominion over the soul itself. By denying baptism, by removing graves, by replacing records with blanks, he was not only erasing children from history, but from eternity. Their lives, however brief, left no trace beyond the pages he controlled. Some who glimpsed the ledgers would carry the memory for the rest of their lives. One dismissed maid recalled the image of an open book where entire pages had been left blank, save for dates marching down the side, each space waiting for a name that never appeared. She swore she felt the air in the room press against her chest, as though the silence of those missing names was suffocating her. She never spoke of it publicly, but she never forgot the look on Thomas's face as he turned the page, quill poised as though he alone held the right to decide whether the next line would be filled or left void. In time, the parish learned to accept the gaps, to live with the sense that something was missing. They did not know how much of it was deliberate, how many lives had been stolen on paper before they were stolen in truth. Yet the unease deepened. Thomas's study remained locked to most, but the aura of its contents seeped outward. The villagers began to understand, though they could not yet speak it aloud, that the greatest cruelty of the Pritchards was not only the silencing of cries in the night, but the erasure of names that should have been carried forward. In the quiet of his study, Thomas Pritchard smiled over his ledgers, the pages glowing faintly in candlelight. To him, the blanks were not empty. They were filled with obedience, with control, with the satisfaction of deciding who would be remembered and who would vanish. And as long as he held the quill, the parish itself was his to write and to erase. The workers on the Pritchard estate had seen hardship before. They were men and women of the land, used to long hours, injuries, and the cruelties that sometimes followed when power was uneven. But what they began to glimpse inside the manor was something different, something that left even hardened farmhands unsettled. It was not the lash or the fist that ruled the Pritchard household. Thomas's punishments did not spill blood. They did not leave bruises that could be seen in the fields. His cruelty was cleaner, quieter, and far more deliberate. He spoke of it as discipline, though those who witnessed it later whispered it was nothing less than ritual. The servants described iron cradles kept in the nursery, heavy frames shaped to mimic the soft beds of infants yet built from bars that locked into place. Once a child was placed within, there was no movement possible. Their arms were pinned to their sides, their legs confined so tightly that even the smallest shift was denied. The iron was cold and unforgiving, and once the cradle was latched, the child was left to lie in perfect stillness, unable to resist. Margaret would stand by, her face expressionless, while Thomas explained that stillness was purity, that restless limbs were the mark of sinful flesh. Hours would pass, sometimes days, before the child was released, their small bodies stiff, their eyes glazed with terror. When food was withheld, it was done not in anger but with ceremony. The children were placed in bare rooms, their knees forced into postures of prayer, their hands tied so that their fingers remained interlocked as though clasped in devotion. Bread and water were placed just out of reach, not as sustenance, but as symbols of temptation. Servants said Thomas would visit these rooms in silence, watching the children weaken, their spines curving as hunger hollowed them. He would murmur that the soul shone brighter when the body was starved of filth, that he was preparing them for heaven untainted by earthly corruption. Some children lasted days, others weeks, but always the end came quietly without screams, their heads bowed as though in final supplication. What disturbed the workers most was not only the suffering itself, but the calm with which it was delivered. There was no rage in Thomas's eyes, no outbursts or violence that might at least suggest passion. Instead, he treated each punishment as though it were a sacred duty. He instructed servants to clean the iron cradles with holy water, to sweep the bare rooms as though they were chapels. He spoke of discipline as cleansing, of suffering as refinement. To him, each act of restraint and deprivation was not cruelty but a gift, an act of devotion that removed the stain of the world from the children he claimed to love. One farmhand, hardened by years of toil, confessed later that he had stumbled upon Margaret carrying a child's body down the hall, its thin frame limp in her arms, its hands still bound in prayer. She carried it not to the churchyard but to the orchard, where Thomas waited with a shovel. The farmhand said the sight froze him in place. It was not only the dead child that haunted him, but the way Margaret's face remained serene, her expression more peaceful than grief-stricken, as though she believed the ritual had freed the child rather than killed it. Thomas, too, moved with calm precision, lowering the body into the soil as if placing it in a bed. The farmhand never spoke of it again while the family lived, but the memory clung to him until his death. The punishments extended beyond the children of the family. Servants' children were sometimes taken into the same rooms, told it was to correct disobedience. They returned thinner, quieter, their eyes hollow, as if a part of them had been stripped away. Some never returned at all. Mothers who worked in the kitchens wept silently at night, their grief pressed down by fear, their loss hidden under the weight of silence the Pritchards demanded. For every disappearance, Thomas produced ledgers that explained it away, a sickness, a departure, a transfer of service. The parish, bound by his records, never pressed further. To the workers, the house grew unbearable. Even the strongest felt their resolve crumble when they heard the sound of iron closing in the nursery, or when they walked past the silent prayer rooms where they imagined eyes staring through the dark. The cruelty was not loud, but it echoed. It filled their sleep, their conversations, their very sense of safety. The Pritchards' methods were not those of wild brutality, but of controlled ritual, each act designed not only to punish, but to erase. Thomas himself defended these punishments openly to those few who questioned him. He would say that children were born impure, that their bodies carried corruption inherited from generations. He claimed that by locking them in stillness and denying them food, he stripped away the filth of flesh and prepared their souls for the purity of eternity. The words unsettled even those who had no choice but to nod in agreement. It was not just cruelty, it was a philosophy, a belief that suffering was salvation, and that he alone was chosen to deliver it. Over time, the workers stopped trying to intervene. Fear sealed their mouths and resignation dulled their hands. They told themselves they were powerless, that speaking out would only lead to dismissal, or worse. Yet within their silence dread festered. The orchard grew lush, the manor remained orderly, and the punishments continued unseen by the parish beyond. The village whispered of the Pritchards' losses, but never of the methods that caused them, for those who knew the truth carried it like a weight too heavy to bear. The discipline left no visible wounds, no bodies laid in churchyards, no marks that could be counted in public. But it hollowed the parish nonetheless. It left neighbors uneasy, workers broken, and children silenced before they could cry out. Thomas called it preparation for heaven, but to those who witnessed it, it was something else entirely. It was the systematic stripping of humanity, the quiet destruction of life disguised as devotion. And though no blood stained the floors, the house itself seemed drenched in absence, a silence deeper than any wound. The parish had not yet seen the full scale of his order, but already the outlines of his methods were clear. The iron cradles, the prayer rooms, the starvation rituals, they were not accidents of grief or misfortune. They were deliberate, designed, and endlessly repeated. Behind the calm facade of the family pew, Thomas Pritchard was shaping his household into something that defied the rhythms of life and death, something bound not by love or faith, but by the cruel order of a man who believed himself the keeper of souls. The orchard on the Pritchard estate was unlike any other in the parish. Its trees grew tall and straight, their branches heavy with fruit that seemed richer in color and thicker in flesh than anything harvested beyond the manor's walls. While other farmers struggled with blight or thin soil, the Pritchards' orchard flourished year after year, immune to the same hardships that plagued their neighbors. From a distance it was beautiful, almost too beautiful, a stretch of trees that glowed in the fading light, their trunks strong, their roots invisible but deep. Yet the villagers looked upon it with unease, for beauty that grew from silence carried the weight of suspicion. The soil beneath the trees was dark, damp, and strangely fertile. Workers remarked that no matter how many baskets of fruit were taken, the trees never seemed to tire, never faltered in yield. Their roots drank something unseen, and their leaves shone with a waxy gleam that made the branches look almost unnatural. Those who worked close to the orchard swore that the earth felt spongy beneath their boots, as though it had been fed with more than water and compost. The smell, too, unsettled them, sweet at times, but with an undercurrent of something metallic, something faintly sour that no amount of breeze could wash away. Margaret Pritchard was often seen among the trees at dawn or dusk, her figure drifting between the trunks, her hands clasped as if in prayer. She tended no baskets, carried no tools, yet her presence there was constant. Some said she hummed while she walked, a sound too faint to be called a song, rising and falling like the wind through dry grass. Others whispered that she carried bundles swaddled in linen, moving carefully so as not to disturb what she bore. What she left behind, no one wished to name aloud. It was only later, in accounts gathered long after the family's decline, that the truth began to surface. Servants who dared to speak described the orchard not as a place of life, but as a graveyard concealed in plain sight. Children who had withered under Thomas's punishments, infants born too weak to endure the iron cradles, were not carried to churchyards or marked with stones. Margaret brought them here instead. She buried them upright, their small bodies bound tightly in linen so that no limb could move. Their mouths were sewn shut with coarse horsehair, their silence preserved forever beneath the soil. She planted them as though they were saplings themselves, set into the earth in rows between the trees. The orchard thrived upon their absence, its roots entangled with the remains of children who were never counted. The horror of it lay not only in the act, but in the calm ritual that surrounded it. Margaret was said to prepare the bodies with care, washing them in basins of cold water, wrapping them in cloth cut from the household linens, stitching their lips as if closing a wound. She carried them in her arms as a mother might, her face serene, her steps steady. To those who glimpsed her through cracks in shutters or from the distant edge of the field, she looked less like a grieving parent than a priestess, officiating over ceremonies the parish was not meant to witness. When the earth closed over each small form, the trees above seemed to grow greener, their branches reaching further into the sky. The villagers grew fearful of the fruit. They would accept baskets from the Pritchards during festivals, but few ever ate what was given. Those who did claimed the taste was strangely thick, sweet in a way that clung to the throat, leaving behind a heaviness they could not explain. Mothers refused to let their children touch the apples or pears, whispering that they carried the silence of the buried with them, that to bite into them was to consume the voices of the lost. Baskets of untouched fruit were left to rot at the edges of homes, their skins darkening, their flesh collapsing, until the stench forced families to bury them far from their doors. The orchard became a place avoided even in daylight. Workers refused to prune its branches or gather its fallen fruit without orders. At night, some swore they saw faint shapes between the trunks, small shadows swaying as if standing upright beneath the earth, their heads bent, their mouths sealed. The wind through the orchard carried a strange sound, neither rustling nor moaning, but something between, a chorus too soft to be called voices, yet too deliberate to be dismissed as chants. Children in the parish grew up fearing the orchard, told never to wander near its borders, for the soil there was not meant to be touched by the living. Margaret herself seemed transformed when she walked there. In the manor she was pale and quiet, her presence restrained. But in the orchard her movements took on a gravity, a certainty. Some believed she drew strength from it, that the act of burying her children there was not grief, but fulfillment. Her serenity was not that of a broken woman, but of someone who believed she was carrying out a higher duty. The orchard became not just a graveyard, but a sanctuary, a place where the family's rituals rooted themselves as deeply as the trees. When visitors came to the estate, the Pritchards spoke proudly of their orchard's yield, of the soil's richness, of the abundance they alone seemed to harvest. They smiled when others praised the beauty of the fruit, but their eyes held a weight that made the compliments fall hollow. The villagers never pressed too hard, for to question abundance in a land of scarcity felt dangerous. Yet beneath the polite exchanges, unease grew sharper. They knew beauty could hide corruption, that bounty could be fed by horror. In the years that followed, the orchard's presence weighed heavier upon the parish than the manor itself. The house could be avoided, its windows ignored, but the orchard stood visible across the fields, its branches heavy with fruit that no one dared to eat. It became a symbol of silence, a reminder of what could be buried and made to flourish without witness. Each season the trees grew fuller, their blossoms whiter, their fruit thicker, as though the earth itself was complicit, feeding on what Margaret placed within it. The villagers could not yet bring themselves to act, but they spoke more openly of their dread. They began to describe the orchard not as a field of trees, but as a place of still tongues, a ground where voices had been bound and planted, their silence feeding roots that spread wider each year. And though they did not yet uncover the truth with their own eyes, they carried the weight of knowing, the certainty that something unnatural grew among them. The orchard remained untouched by axe or fire, its branches rising against the sky, bearing fruit that no one dared to claim. Beneath its roots lay generations of children denied the right to cry, their bodies silenced, their mouths sewn shut. And the Pritchards walked among the trees as though they alone understood the bargain struck between soil and silence, as though the orchard itself had become their covenant. Among the many whispers that clung to the Pritchards, none were more unsettling than those about the children who survived. Not all were carried into the orchard. Some lived past infancy, though to call it living was perhaps the wrong word. They were seen only rarely, and then only by the servants who worked deep within the manor, carrying trays through long corridors or lighting lamps before the household retired for the night. These children were not like others. They were pale and weightless, their skin stretched tight over bones, their eyes wide yet vacant, and their mouths kept shut as though silence had been trained into them. They did not play. They did not laugh. They did not speak. They drifted through the halls like shadows, as though their lives had been pared down to the bare minimum of existence. It was said they were moved only at night. A servant once claimed she heard the shuffle of small feet after the household had gone still, faint patters across the stone floor, followed by the soft thud of doors closing in sequence. By morning, the children were gone again, hidden away before sunlight could reveal them. Their rooms, when glimpsed, were sparse and unnatural. Narrow beds with stiff sheets, basins of water left untouched, shutters drawn so tightly that not a trace of daylight could enter. It was as though their existence was not meant for the world outside, as though even the light of day was too much for them. The servants believed the children were kept mute by more than fear. Bottles of laudanum and jars of powdered opium were stored in the household like flour and salt, dispensed with the same casual hand. Traces of it were mixed into their food and drinks, dulling their movements, slowing their voices until no sound came at all. Their limbs grew stiff, their bodies conditioned into unnatural stillness. They could sit for hours without shifting, their backs straight, their hands resting neatly on their knees, their eyes fixed forward as though awaiting command. Some said they had been forced into iron braces that shaped their posture until their muscles no longer remembered how to relax. Others whispered that their bones had been bound while still forming, conditioned into rigidity so complete that movement became impossible. The effect was haunting. To see them was to look upon children who were alive yet already erased, present yet absent. Their humanity stripped away until they resembled dolls more than human beings. Their faces carried no expression, their mouths rarely opened, and when they did, only the faintest breath escaped. They seemed neither asleep nor awake, caught in some suspended state where time passed around them but not through them. Workers who encountered them in darkened halls said the air grew colder, as though the silence of the orchard had seeped into their very skin. What disturbed the servants most was the sense that the children had accepted their condition. There were no cries for help, no rebellion, no flicker of resistance in their eyes. Whatever suffering they endured had broken them so completely that compliance was all that remained. It was as if they had been trained to erase themselves, to embody the same blankness that Thomas etched into his ledgers. Their existence was proof of survival, but survival emptied of meaning, survival without growth, without voice, without future. At times, Margaret was seen leading them through the halls, her hand resting lightly on the shoulder of one child, her pace slow and measured. She looked upon them not with grief but with a calm pride, as though she believed their stillness was virtue, their silence purity. She would guide them into locked rooms where no servant was allowed to enter, returning alone hours later with her face serene. Whatever happened inside those rooms remained hidden, but the children who emerged afterward were always quieter, always stiffer, always more ghost-like than before. The villagers knew nothing of these heirs, for the children never appeared outside the manor walls. They were never brought to church, never introduced as part of the family line, never allowed to walk in the village lanes. Their existence was spoken of only in hushed tones by those who served and saw them, and even then details shifted like shadows. Some claimed there were 3, others 5, still others more, though the number never remained steady. The only certainty was that they remained unseen, hidden away like secrets too fragile or too monstrous to face the light of day. The servants grew to dread their presence. One recalled carrying a tray of bread into a dim corridor, only to find a child standing perfectly still in the center of the passage, hands clasped, eyes wide and unblinking. She placed the tray down and fled without a word, too shaken to pass by. Another swore he felt the brush of fingers against his sleeve in the dark, but when he turned, no one was there, only the faint smell of laudanum lingering in the air. The children seemed less like inhabitants of the manor than specters bound to it, echoes of lives that were denied even as they continued to breathe. It was said that Thomas referred to them as his perfected heirs. In his view, they had been stripped of earthly impurity, freed from the distractions of play, speech, or desire. To him, they were closer to angels than to children prepared for eternity through stillness and silence. He recorded them in his ledgers not by name but by number, lines of entries that marked them as kept or prepared. To see them as human would have undermined his design. They were, in his mind, vessels for an order too precise to allow the messiness of life. For the parish, their absence from the public eye was its own form of erasure. Families who had once spoken of the Pritchards' many pregnancies eventually stopped asking after the children at all. It was easier to pretend they did not exist than to press for answers that could not be given. And so the heirs who never grew remained shadows behind shuttered windows, never counted, never blessed, never mourned. Their silence spread outward, pressing upon the servants, seeping into the village, shaping a legacy of fear that grew heavier with each passing year. The orchard was filled with those who had been buried, but the manor itself held the ones who lived without living, ghost-like presences who embodied the same absence as the dead. Together they formed the true legacy of the Pritchards, a lineage not of thriving heirs, but of erased children, bodies present but voices denied. And as the years continued, the line between life and death blurred so completely within those walls that even the servants no longer knew which was worse: to be buried in silence or to walk among the living already erased. Ellen Harrow had worked in the Pritchard household longer than most, her hands calloused from years of polishing wood that never lost its cold sheen, her eyes dulled by the weight of silence that clung to every corridor. She knew better than to ask questions, yet she also knew the house had corners that invited curiosity, places where the silence seemed to thicken as though it were hiding something. It was in one of those corners that she stumbled upon the drawer. She had been dusting Thomas Pritchard's study, careful not to disturb the ledgers that filled the desk, when the corner of her rag caught on a thin seam below the lowest drawer. The panel shifted slightly under her touch. What she uncovered was not meant for anyone outside the family's gaze. Inside the hidden compartment lay bundles of letters stacked neatly, each tied with black thread. The paper was thick and stained with age, yet the handwriting was unmistakable. Thomas's precise, deliberate script. Ellen's heart quickened as she lifted one. The salutation was formal, addressed to an official whose name was written with care as though the words were destined for government eyes. The body of the letter was brief, factual, and chilling. It recorded the birth of a child, followed immediately by its death, the cause listed in clinical detail: weakness of breath, starvation of spirit, impurity of body. At the bottom, Thomas had signed his name in full, but the seal was missing. The letter had never been sent. The next bundle was the same. Names written in careful script, ages marked in days or weeks, causes of death described without hesitation. Some letters recorded multiple children, each reduced to a line of cause and effect. None bore dates that matched the parish records. In fact, None had ever been entered in those official ledgers at all. They existed only here in Thomas's hidden archive, letters that would never reach the hands of those who might have investigated. Ellen felt the weight of them grow heavier as she read on. Each letter was a confession, yet also a denial, a ritual that both acknowledged and erased in the same motion. The pattern became clear. Thomas needed the act of writing as much as he needed the act of erasure. He wrote as if to unburden himself to an authority, but he denied that authority the power to receive his words. The letters were carefully folded, tied, and hidden, never carried beyond the walls of the manor. To write them was to admit the children's existence, but to keep them hidden was to deny that existence any place in the world. It was a compulsion as calculated as the blank ledgers. Every child both recorded and erased, remembered and forgotten. Ellen's hands trembled as she traced the ink. Some letters described deaths that matched whispers she had heard. The sudden silence of cries in the nursery, the stiff bodies carried through halls at dawn. Others named children she had never known existed, infants who must have lived and died entirely unseen, their only trace left in these hidden documents. She realized with a shudder that the orchard's soil might hold more bodies than anyone had ever imagined, and that these letters were the only record of their names. Yet even those names were doomed to rot in secret, bound to paper that would never be delivered. She placed the bundle back into the drawer, her pulse racing, her breath shallow. She knew she should not have looked. That discovery alone could cost her position, perhaps even her life, and yet she could not unsee what she had found. The letters haunted her, their words pressing into her memory as though written there permanently. At night she dreamed of children whispering their names into her ear, only for their voices to vanish mid-syllable, replaced by the sound of Thomas's pen scratching across parchment. For Thomas, this ritual seemed to be another form of control. By writing the letters, he proved to himself that the children had lived, if only briefly. By never sending them, he confirmed his power to decide whether they deserved to be known. He created a private archive of lives reduced to statistics, bound to his will alone. Each unsent letter was both a document and a tombstone, a record that locked identity away rather than setting it free. In his mind, he was not destroying truth. He was containing it, owning it, folding it into silence. Ellen kept her discovery secret, though the knowledge weighed on her like a stone. She noticed how Thomas lingered in the study late into the night, how his candle burned low while he bent over the desk, his quill moving steadily, his face illuminated with calm satisfaction. She realized then that he was not simply keeping records, he was performing rituals. Every stroke of ink was part of a ceremony in which life and death were acknowledged only to be concealed again. The letters were not drafts waiting for delivery. They were finished works, complete only when they were hidden. Over time, Ellen began to hear rumors from other servants, scraps of stories that confirmed what she knew but dared not reveal. Some had seen Thomas smoothing the folded letters as if caressing a child's brow. Others had heard him whisper the names aloud before sealing them into bundles, his voice soft, reverent, almost tender. He seemed to find peace in these acts, as though the children he had broken were restored to him only in the act of being written down and hidden. The contradiction was grotesque. To kill a life in silence, then resurrect it briefly on paper only to bury it again in a drawer. The villagers, of course, remained unaware. They wondered still at the missing graves and the absent baptisms, but they did not know that in the heart of the manor lay a false archive, a library of letters that would never leave its walls. Each child existed there in name, if not in flesh, in ink, if not in memory, yet locked away from the world as if their lives were too fragile, too contaminated to be shared. Ellen never confessed what she had found until many years later. when the house was finally opened after the Pritchards were gone. Even then, her voice shook, and her eyes filled with tears as she described the drawer and the letters. She said it was like standing at the edge of a graveyard where the headstones had been written but never raised, a place where the dead could be counted but not mourned. It was then that investigators realized the depth of Thomas's compulsion. He had created not just a household of silence, but an entire shadow world of records and erasures, a reality in which he alone decided who would be seen and who would be buried in words that no one would ever read. When the Pritchard line finally ended, it did not happen with ceremony. There were no heirs brought forth, no will read in public, no procession of mourners to fill the churchyard. The manor grew quiet, its shutters closed for weeks, until the silence itself forced the parish to act. Neighbors gathered at the gates, uneasy yet compelled, their curiosity sharpened by years of whispers. When no servant came to answer, they forced the doors open. What they found within did not feel like trespass. It felt like entering a tomb. The air inside the house was stale, heavy with the smell of damp wood and something far more bitter beneath it. Dust clung to every surface, but there were no signs of life, no fires burning, no meals left half-eaten, no footsteps echoing across the floors. The stillness was suffocating, as though the house had been holding its breath for generations and only now exhaled its secrets. At first the villagers moved cautiously, their voices low, but soon the weight of discovery pressed them forward. They spread through the manor, opening rooms that had long been closed. In the study they found the ledgers, row after row of them, each page filled with blanks and tallies. The sight chilled even those who had suspected what Thomas had done. Here was proof in ink. Lives counted yet erased, names denied. The quiet cruelty of a man who believed he owned the right to decide who existed. But the ledgers were only the beginning. In the attic, beneath layers of dust, they uncovered wooden trunks stacked neatly against the walls. The first trunk was pried open with trembling hands, and inside lay bones, small and fragile, arranged with care. They were not scattered as though abandoned, but packed tightly, each skeleton folded into itself, wrapped in decaying linen that crumbled at the touch. Closer inspection revealed something far worse. Numbers had been carved into the bones, tiny scratches etched into ribs, skulls, and femurs, marking each body not with a name but with a sequence. One bore the number 17, another 31, another 64. The villagers recoiled in horror. These were not graves hidden in soil, but archives of remains catalogued not as people but as entries in Thomas's private system. Names had been denied, but order had been imposed, the kind of order only he valued. Each body was a record, stripped of identity, reduced to a number carved into fragile bone. As more trunks were opened, the horror multiplied. Skeletons of infants, children, even young adults filled the containers. Some bore traces of bindings around their limbs, the remnants of cloth hardened into brittle ropes. Others showed the marks of enforced stillness, joints locked unnaturally, spines bent in positions of kneeling prayer. There was no violence that spilled blood, yet the bones themselves carried evidence of long cruelty, of bodies trained into silence before death finally claimed them. It was not a massacre. It was something slower, methodical, a discipline carried out until existence itself was broken. The villagers could not contain their cries. Some wept openly, others shouted for the vicar, others stumbled from the attic, unable to endure the sight. Yet the discoveries did not end there. In the nursery they found the iron cradles, their bars rusted but still intact, their shapes unmistakable. In the narrow rooms of prayer, ropes still dangled from the walls, ready to bind hands into permanent clasp. Shelves in hidden chambers were lined with jars. each filled with scraps of parchment, fragments of letters, locks of hair labeled with numbers rather than names. Every object confirmed what had been whispered for years, that the Pritchards had built their household on erasure, turning life into silence and silence into record. Authorities were summoned, and soon the manor became a site of dismantling. Room by room, they uncovered evidence too grim to dismiss. The trunks of bones were carried down in silence, their contents laid out in the churchyard for counting. The ledgers were collected, each page examined, the blank entries weighed against the remains now laid bare. Investigators whispered to one another as the scale became clear. Generations of children had been erased, not lost to chance or sickness, but deliberately denied the right to exist. The orchard was dug into, and beneath its roots they found more linen-wrapped forms, their mouths still bound with coarse stitches, their bodies placed upright between the trees. The land itself had been part of the ritual, complicit in the silence. The parish watched with horror as the house was emptied piece by piece. Each discovery seemed to confirm not only the cruelty of the Pritchards, but the complicity of those who had looked away. For years the villagers had whispered and wondered, yet they had never acted, never pressed too hard. Now they saw what their silence had allowed. The truth lay in open air, undeniable, and it shamed them as much as it horrified them. The vicar wept when he saw the bones. He said the numbers carved into them were blasphemy, a denial of God's own naming, a theft of souls as much as of lives. He spoke of baptism withheld, of graves denied, of lives recorded only in hidden letters that were never meant to be seen. The parishioners bowed their heads, unable to meet his eyes. They had lived alongside evil clothed in respectability, and only now did they see how complete that evil had been. The dismantling continued for weeks. The manor's walls were stripped, its rooms emptied, its secrets dragged into daylight. What had been whispers became screams of history, undeniable records of horror. By the time the last trunk was carried out, the Pritchard house no longer felt like a home. It was a carcass, hollowed by its own secrets, a shell that could not stand beneath the weight of what had been exposed. When the work was finished, the villagers refused to let the manor stand. They demanded it be torn down, stone by stone, until nothing remained. They said the walls were too stained, the floors too saturated with silence to ever be cleansed. And so it was dismantled, each block carried away, each beam burned, until the land lay bare. Where the house had once stood, only scorched earth remained, a wound in the parish that would not heal quickly. The silence that had lingered for generations had finally broken, but what it revealed left scars deeper than any words could mend. The parish could not undo what had been done. They could only bear witness, count the bones, and carry forward the memory of what had been hidden behind those walls. The Pritchard name was never spoken with respect again. It became a curse, a reminder of how evil had lived in silence and how silence had allowed it to thrive.